If you're new to spearfishing, I believe getting a GoPro as your first piece of electronic equipment is a mistake. I think you're far better off getting a dive watch. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Daniel Mann, and in this video, I'm going to explain why I think the first piece of electronic equipment you should be investing in as a spearfisher is a dive watch, not this GoPro. I only recently reflected on how useful a dive watch is when I was midway through a dive and my old dive watch actually died. It just stopped working, screen went blank, and that was it. Now, the biggest problem for me in that situation was the fact that I had told my wife I would be back on shore by 7 p.m. I entered the water at about 4:30. I had no idea what time it was, and if you miss those texts, you're going to be in a lot of trouble and you're going to unnecessarily raise an alarm. If you tell somebody you're going to be back on shore, you should be back on shore texting them, otherwise they're going to start freaking out. So that was the first problem. Secondly, I had no idea what my surface interval times were. This makes it very difficult to stick to my rule of thumb of 3 times my bottom time. I tried counting in my head, I tried counting off my GoPro time, but I just didn't feel comfortable. I couldn't accurately tell how long I'd been on the surface, and I struggled to get into the groove, to be honest, so it just wasn't my day. I knew that I couldn't tell the time, so I just headed in and called it a day. Why 3 times my bottom time? Because that is a general rule of thumb that I have learned that will minimize the risk of shallow water blackout. Obviously, nothing is foolproof, but for me, 3 times my bottom time is what I'm really comfortable with. Say if I'm down for a minute, I'll stay on the surface for at least 3 minutes before I dive again. If it's a 1.5 minute dive, I will stay on the surface for 4.5 minutes before diving again. Often, a lot of people will be buying a dive watch just so they can see how deep they're diving. That isn't a great measure of your spearfishing success. Successful spearfishing is what's in the icebox at the end of the day, not what numbers are displayed on this watch. Yes, this does display the depth, and I find that's a very useful piece of information. If I'm diving on a pinnacle that I know comes up to 10 meters and suddenly I'm diving at 25, I know I've missed the spot. I know that I'm not in the right area. Also, if the water's a little bit deeper, say 25 or 30 meters, I will probably give myself a little bit of extra surface time just because I know that it's going to be a deeper dive, it's going to be more taxing on the body. If you're one of those people that look at their dive watch on the bottom, that is a terrible habit. Please do yourself a favor, stop doing it, because if you're looking at your dive watch, you're not looking at the fish. So the only time I ever look at my dive watch is on the surface after a dive, so I know how long I have to give myself before I dive again, and how deep it was, and how long the dive time was. Speaking of the dive time, that is another useful feature of these dive watches, which goes hand in hand with the rule of 3. It tells you how long your dive time was, and on this particular watch, it cycles in big bold letters at the top how long it has been since I last dived. So it's really easy for me to just peer at my watch and see, yes, that's been 3 minutes since my last 1 minute dive. Possibly the primary reason of getting any sort of watch is to tell the time. Now, you can tell the time on any sort of watch. Yes, you can do that. You can take it off your GPS or any other electronic piece of equipment, but telling the time is a little bit more important than knowing what time it is, if it's lunchtime or something like that. Knowing what time it is when you're spearfishing is crucial when you're trying to dive areas where a tide is going to run. So you know that you have X amount of time before the tide will push, or X amount of time before the tide is going to slow down, and that's your window of opportunity to fish something on a slack tide. Alternatively, if you're a shore diver, knowing how long it took you to swim to a spot is really helpful information. For instance, there's a spot that I dive and it is 2 kilometers offshore, and I know that it takes me 40 minutes to get there. So when the tide starts running the other way, I know I have to head home. I know that I have 40 minutes before I get back to the shore, so I can time myself to make sure that I get back to my car and send those text messages to let my loved ones know that I'm okay, I'm all safe. Also, on time dives, competitions, it's crucial to have a dive watch for a competition to know how long you've got left of the competition, and again, if you're shore diving, how far you've swum, how long it took you to get there, etc., so you don't get any penalty points if you arrive back late. Another cool feature on most dive watches is a temperature display. Now, why is this useful? Well, if you're diving in an area, say Brisbane, and you jump in there at winter and you know that you're expecting about 19 degrees, but suddenly there's a hot flush of water that's come in from a southerly blow, and it's August and the water's now suddenly 22 degrees. You could start thinking that maybe I might be seeing wahoo, maybe I'll be seeing Spanish mackerel, because they tend to push in with warmer water. And if you know this information, you can plan your dives accordingly and maybe be more successful. Another example here in the UK this year, it was cold for such a long time. In June, where you'd expect 16 or 17 degree water, some places were still sitting at around 13 degrees. Now, if I go out in a 5mm wetsuit expecting 16 or 17 degrees, and then I'm going to do a long shore dive for say 4 or 5 hours, if I now jump in and it's 13 degrees, I'm probably going to get very, very cold very, very quickly. So if I jump in and I find this out, I might want to hit a smaller number of spots and not swim as far as I anticipated, or plan to make my dive a little bit shorter so that I don't get cold and risk getting really fatigued or cramped up because I'm cold. Like everything in life, there is a right and wrong way to use something. Using this water bottle to slap myself in the face with it is the wrong way to use it. Similarly, using a dive watch to obsess over the numbers, the depth, the dive times is the wrong way to use this. Use it as a safety tool and a way to find fish. For instance, the tide times and the temperature. If you start seeing fish at a certain time of day, make a note of it to say that it was midday and the high tide was at 10 o'clock, and you know that 2 hours after high tide, turbo fish. That sort of information is priceless and is going to help you a lot more than being able to hold your breath for an extra 10 or 15 seconds. Remember, the idea is to shoot fish, not get big numbers on this. Now, call me a millennial because I rely on electronic equipment too heavily, but I feel very naked without my dive watch when I go diving. Also, I know lots of guys that are amazing spearfishers that dive without a watch and they've never dived with a watch, or they just can't be bothered with a watch and they just listen to their body. Ultimately, you still have to listen to your body, and whatever you choose, just be safe out there. Now, what do I think is the better option? Definitely the dive watch over the GoPro. The only reason I think that a GoPro would be more beneficial for a new diver is if you're in an area with lots of species and you don't know what they are. You could use this to identify what they are. But when you're a new diver, you want to be safe. Don't focus on getting a GoPro, just focus on hunting and loading your spear gun, swimming around, getting comfortable in the water. It's ironic for me to be saying don't get a GoPro when I make videos for a living, but I sincerely believe that dive watch will serve you a lot better in the long run. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. It actually makes a difference. If you disagree with what I said or you agree with what I said, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Subscribe if you're not already, because this channel is all about spearfishing. And if you've clicked on this video, you probably like spearfishing. I'll see you on the next one. Also, if you're wondering, I used a different watch in the thumbnail because it looked a bit cooler than this D4 for the thumbnail, so that's why I used that watch. And thank you to Peter McKinnon for doing the tutorial on throwing objects into fish tanks and taking photos of them to make them look really cool for thumbnails such as this video. Thanks, Peter.